a Navy SEAL with 17 years of elite training, a chest full of medals, the kind of warrior America builds its legends around. And then, he comes back from 3 weeks in the jungle and says he will never lead American troops again. What the hell happened out there? This isn't some Hollywood drama. This is a classified story the Pentagon buried for 50 years. A story about an American hero who watched Australian SAS operators do things that made him question everything he ever learned about warfare. Things so effective, so psychologically devastating, that Washington couldn't officially admit they existed, because admitting them meant confessing that America's closest allies were running circles around them in the jungle, that their methods were 10 times, sometimes 50 times, more lethal than anything the U.S. military had developed. And here's the kicker. When this SEAL tried to tell his superiors what he'd witnessed, they didn't promote him. They didn't study his reports. They classified everything and shipped him off to a desk job where he'd never influence another soldier again. Why? What did he see? What did the Australians do that was so effective it had to be erased from history? Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why one of America's finest warriors walked away from command, and why the Pentagon prayed you'd never find out the truth. Let's get into it. The helicopter blades had barely stopped rotating at Nui Dat when Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb realized everything he knew about jungle warfare was wrong. 23 days earlier, this decorated Navy SEAL had arrived in Vietnam with 17 years of elite training, a chest full of commendations, and the unshakable confidence of a man who believed American special operations represented the pinnacle of military evolution. Now, standing on that same landing zone with a 1,000-yard stare and trembling hands, he would make a decision that would haunt the Pentagon for decades. He formally requested reassignment away from any command position over American troops. A Navy SEAL, refusing to lead Americans. The brass couldn't believe what they were reading. But this was only the first shock in a story that would shatter everything Washington believed about who was really winning the jungle war. The year was 1969, and the war in Vietnam had already consumed more than 40,000 American lives. Something far more disturbing than enemy body counts had shattered this elite warrior's worldview. What Marcus Webb witnessed during his 3-week embed with the Australian Special Air Service Regiment would force him to question every tactical doctrine he had ever learned. It would reveal a terrifying truth that the United States military establishment desperately wanted to keep buried. Their closest allies were fighting an entirely different war. They were using methods so effective and so psychologically devastating that American commanders couldn't officially acknowledge them. Why? Because acknowledging them meant admitting their own catastrophic failures. And that admission was something the Pentagon would bury for the next 5 decades. The official paperwork called it a _0. The classified cable traffic told a different story entirely. In early March of 1969, analysts at the Defense Intelligence Agency had flagged an anomaly so disturbing that it triggered an immediate investigation. Australian SAS patrols operating in Phuoc Tuy Province were achieving elimination ratios that defied mathematical possibility. While American units were trading casualties at rates of 1 to 8 or 1 to 12 against Viet Cong forces, the Australians were posting numbers that seemed like typographical errors. 1 to 50, 1 to 75, sometimes 1 to over 100. Someone in Washington demanded answers, and Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb, with his impeccable record and his reputation for brutal honesty, was chosen to find them. But what the Pentagon expected and what Webb would discover were 2 completely different things. The Pentagon's real motivation ran deeper than mere curiosity. By 1969, the American war effort was hemorrhaging credibility both at home and abroad. Student protests had paralyzed universities. Walter Cronkite had declared the war unwinnable. And within the classified corridors of military intelligence, a more specific fear was taking hold. What if America's allies were outperforming them so dramatically that the discrepancy could never be explained away? Webb's mission was straightforward on paper. Observe Australian SAS operations. Document their methods. Determine whether their success rates could be replicated by American forces. What the Pentagon didn't anticipate was that their chosen observer would return fundamentally broken. His faith in American military doctrine? Shattered beyond repair. and the nightmare was just beginning. The first warning signs appeared within hours of Webb's arrival at the Australian Task Force headquarters in Nui Dat. He had expected to find a familiar military environment. The buzz of radio communications, the constant helicopter traffic, the aggressive forward-leaning posture that characterized American operations. Instead, he found something that unsettled him in ways he couldn't immediately articulate. The Australian compound was quiet. Not the quiet of inactivity, but the quiet of deliberate restraint. Soldiers moved with an economy of motion that seemed almost serpentine. Conversations happened in murmurs. Even the mess hall operated at a volume that would have been considered suspicious whispers in an American installation. Webb had walked into a world that operated by completely different rules. Rules that no American had ever been taught. Sergeant Major Thomas Brennan was assigned as Webb's primary contact, and their first meeting established a dynamic that would define the weeks to come. Brennan was a lean, sun-darkened man whose eyes held the flat assessment of someone who had long ago stopped being impressed by rank or reputation. When Webb introduced himself with his full title and a list of his operational credentials, Brennan simply nodded and said 4 words that would prove prophetic. "We'll see about that." The Australians' dismissiveness stung Webb's professional pride. Here was an American Navy SEAL, a member of the most elite special operations force on the planet, being treated like a boot camp recruit. And by whom? A man whose nation's entire military could fit inside a single American division. But the real humiliation hadn't even started yet. Webb swallowed his irritation and asked when he could observe his first patrol. Brennan's answer shocked him to his core. Quote 2. This was not how American military cooperation worked. Liaison officers observed. They took notes. They attended briefings and wrote reports. They did not strap on weapons and disappear into triple canopy jungle with foreign operators whose methods were completely unknown. But Webb recognized the test for what it was, and he accepted. What he didn't understand was that the test had already begun. Brennan and his team had been evaluating the American from the moment he stepped off the helicopter. The way he walked, the volume of his voice, the unconscious habits of a man trained in American tactical doctrine. And what they saw concerned them deeply. The preparation for Webb's first patrol revealed the first major tactical divergence between American and Australian approaches. In American special operations, mission preparation was a comprehensive affair. Detailed intelligence briefings, satellite imagery analysis, predetermined extraction points, layered fire support coordination. The Americans planned for every contingency with backup plans for their backup plans. The Australians did something radically different. They prepared their bodies and their minds for the jungle itself. Webb watched in growing disbelief as the 4-man SAS patrol that would become his temporary family spent their preparation time in ways that seemed almost primitive. They studied topographical maps, yes, but they also spent hours examining botanical samples from the operational area. They reviewed intelligence on enemy movements, but they spent equal time discussing the habits of local wildlife whose disturbance patterns could betray human presence. This wasn't modern warfare. This was something ancient dressed in military uniforms. Most disturbing to Webb was what they didn't do. There was no coordinated artillery support arranged. No helicopter gunship standing by on 5-minute alert. No predetermined extraction point where they could call for emergency evacuation. When Webb asked about these seemingly fundamental elements of special operations doctrine, Brennan's answer chilled him. Fire support means noise. Noise means they know where we are. If they know where we are, we've already failed. We don't need extraction points because we don't plan to be found. The words hung in the humid air like a death sentence. No backup. No rescue. No cavalry coming over the hill. Just 4 men who planned to become invisible. And Webb was about to learn exactly how they did it. The Australian philosophy became clearer over the following hours. American special operations had evolved around the principle of overwhelming superiority. Better weapons, better communications, better fire support, better extraction capabilities. If something went wrong, you called in the cavalry. The Australians had developed their doctrine around a completely opposite principle: never be found in the first place. But there was still one more preparation ritual that would disturb Webb more than anything else. On the night before deployment, he witnessed something that his training reports would later describe as psychologically conditioning techniques of uncertain origin. What he saw that night would haunt him for the rest of his life. The 4 SAS operators gathered in a small clearing behind their barracks as darkness fell. Webb had been invited to observe but not participate. What he witnessed defied everything he understood about modern military professionalism. The men sat in a loose circle while their aboriginal tracker, a quiet man named Jimmy Doolin, whose presence Webb had barely registered until that moment, began speaking in a low, rhythmic voice. Doolin talked about the jungle not as terrain to be conquered, but as a living entity to be joined. He described the enemy not as opposing soldiers but as prey to be hunted. He spoke of the patrol members not as warriors, but as predators who would become invisible, silent, and patient. This was not motivational speaking as Webb understood it. American military psychology emphasized aggression, dominance, and the warrior's superior will. What Doolin was describing sounded more like a hunting ritual from 10,000 years before firearms were invented. Webb's logical mind rebelled against the mysticism, but his operational instincts noticed something else. The 4 SAS operators weren't just listening to Doolin's words. They were physically transforming. Their breathing slowed. Their eyes took on a focused intensity that Webb had only seen in the most elite snipers at the moment before a shot. Their body language shifted from the casual posture of off-duty soldiers to something more predatory, more patient, more dangerous. Whatever Doolin was doing, it was working. And Webb found himself simultaneously fascinated and disturbed by methods that seemed to belong more to the Stone Age than to modern special warfare. But the ritual was just preparation. The real education would begin at 0300 hours, and it would break everything Webb thought he knew. The patrol departed in total darkness, and within the first hour, Webb understood why American units were losing. It wasn't firepower. It wasn't courage. It wasn't even training in the conventional sense. It was something far more fundamental. Americans made noise. Webb had spent nearly 2 decades learning to move quietly through hostile environments. He had completed the most demanding stealth training the United States military offered. He had operated successfully in jungle, desert, mountain, and urban terrain across 3 continents. And within 60 minutes of entering the Vietnamese bush with an Australian SAS patrol, he realized he moved through the jungle like a wounded elephant. Every step Webb took produced sounds, small sounds, sounds that would have been imperceptible in an American patrol where everyone was making similar noise. But against the absolute silence of the Australians, his footfalls sounded like drumbeats. Twice in the first hour, Brennan materialized beside him like a ghost and placed a hand on his shoulder. Each time, Webb froze in place while Brennan pointed at some obstacle he hadn't even noticed. A dried leaf that would have crackled, a root that would have snapped, a vine that would have scraped against his equipment. By the 3rd hour, Webb's confidence had evaporated entirely. He was a liability. Every step he took increased the patrol's detection risk, and the Australians knew it. What they did next surprised him completely. Rather than treating him with contempt or sending him back, they began teaching him. In absolute silence, using only hand signals and physical demonstration, Brennan and his team showed Webb a different way of moving through the jungle. The technique was devastatingly simple and almost impossible to execute. Instead of stepping forward and then placing weight on the lead foot, the Australian method required lifting the foot high, extending it forward with the toes pointed down, and then slowly rolling the sole across the ground surface while maintaining perfect balance on the rear leg. Only after the lead foot had explored its landing zone and confirmed silent placement would weight transfer begin. Webb had learned dozens of stealth movement techniques in his career. None of them came close to this in terms of sheer silence achieved, and none of them were this physically demanding. Within the first kilometer of attempting the Australian method, his thighs were burning. By the 3rd kilometer, his leg muscles were in open revolt. The technique required maintaining a deep squat position for hours, while moving at a pace that would have seemed comically slow to any conventional soldier. But he was getting quieter. Not Australian quiet, not yet, but quieter than he had ever been before. The patrol's objective was a suspected Viet Cong resupply route approximately 12 kilometers from the nearest friendly position. In American operational planning, 12 kilometers was a reasonable distance for a single-day mission with helicopter insertion and extraction. The Australians had a different concept of time, and that difference would shatter Webb's understanding of what was possible. They moved at a pace that Webb initially thought was impossibly slow, 300 meters per hour, sometimes less. A 12-kilometer patrol would take 4 days of movement alone, with additional time for observation and any tactical actions. Webb's American instincts screamed against this approach. 4 days in enemy territory without fire support, without extraction capability, without even regular communication checks? The risk seemed astronomical, but as the first day bled into the second, and the second into the third, he began to understand the mathematics of a different equation. American patrols moved fast and loud, relying on firepower to survive contact with the enemy. This meant they were constantly being detected, constantly being tracked, constantly fighting engagements that eroded their strength and revealed their positions. The Australians moved slow and silent, avoiding detection entirely. They didn't fight engagements because the enemy never knew they were there. The result was a complete inversion of risk. American patrols traded speed for constant danger. Australian patrols traded time for near-total security. And in the brutal arithmetic of jungle warfare, the Australian equation produced dramatically better results. On the third day, Webb witnessed the first practical demonstration of this principle. The patrol had established a concealed observation position overlooking a trail junction when a Viet Cong supply column appeared. 18 enemy combatants, heavily laden with ammunition and rice, moving through what they clearly believed was secure territory. Webb's training screamed for action. Call in air support, set an ambush, engage and destroy. The Australians did none of these things. They watched, they photographed, they documented, and they let the enemy pass. When Webb's expression communicated his confusion, Brennan silently indicated that he should continue watching. Over the next several hours, 3 more supply columns used the same route. The Australians documented everything: numbers, equipment, direction of travel, timing patterns. They were building an intelligence picture that no amount of kinetic action could have provided. Only after the 4th column passed did Brennan indicate that tactical action would follow. But what came next would shatter everything Webb believed about special operations warfare. And it would change him forever. The Australian ambush was unlike anything in American tactical doctrine. There was no pre-planned kill zone, no coordinated fire lanes, no withdrawal route, no artillery on standby. There were 4 men with rifles who knew exactly what they were going to do and needed nothing else. The 5th supply column appeared at dusk. 11 enemy combatants moving in a loose file. The Australians let them walk directly into the patrol's position, so close that Webb could have reached out and touched the trailing man. His finger tightened on his trigger. His heart hammered. Every instinct demanded action. Brennan's hand on his arm was like iron. Wait. The column passed. The Australians let them go. Webb's confusion lasted only seconds. As the enemy column moved beyond the patrol's position, a single shot cracked from somewhere in the gathering darkness. The last man in the column dropped without a sound. The column ahead continued walking, unaware that their number had decreased by 1. 70 meters further along the trail, another shot. Another silent casualty. The column still hadn't registered that they were being eliminated one by one from behind. Webb watched in horrified fascination as the Australian patrol systematically worked through the enemy column, taking men from the rear with surgical precision. By the time the lead elements realized something was wrong, 7 of their 11 comrades had ceased to exist. The remaining 4 scattered into the jungle, and the Australians made no effort to pursue them. The entire engagement had lasted less than 3 minutes. 11 enemy combatants had been reduced to 4 terrified survivors, and not a single Australian had fired more than twice. There had been no radio calls, no air support, no artillery, no helicopters, just 4 men with rifles and the patience of predators. But the tactical execution wasn't what disturbed Webb most. What disturbed him was what happened next. The Australians moved through the engagement site with a methodical efficiency that Webb would later describe as ritualistic. They collected weapons, ammunition, and documents with professional thoroughness. They photographed the fallen. They removed identifying equipment and personal effects. Then they did something that made Webb's blood run cold. One of the operators, a lean Queensland farm boy named Corporal Danny Ricks, produced a knife and began modifying the footwear of the eliminated combatants. He cut distinctive patterns into the rubber soles, patterns that Webb didn't immediately understand, but which clearly held meaning for the Australians. When Webb demanded an explanation, Brennan's answer was delivered in the same flat tone he used for everything. Quote 6. Webb struggled to process what he was witnessing. This wasn't just tactical warfare. This was psychological warfare of a kind that American doctrine explicitly prohibited. The Australians were sending messages written in the flesh of their enemies. But the boot modification was only the beginning. What followed would appear in Webb's classified report as, quote, 7. The Australians positioned the fallen in specific poses. They arranged equipment in particular patterns. They left markers that would communicate unmistakable messages to whoever discovered them. The message was simple. The ghosts of the jungle were here, and no one was safe. And this was still just the first patrol. The patrol's return journey took another 3 days, and during that time, Webb's transformation accelerated. He had arrived in Vietnam as an observer sent to document methods. He was returning as something else entirely, a man whose entire tactical worldview had been demolished and rebuilt from the ground up. The Australians didn't lecture him. They didn't provide formal instruction. They simply demonstrated their methods through action and allowed him to draw his own conclusions. And the conclusions Webb drew were devastating to his American professional pride. The United States military had invested billions of dollars developing sophisticated jungle warfare capabilities. They had deployed hundreds of thousands of troops with the most advanced weapons, the best logistical support, and the most overwhelming firepower in military history. And they were being outperformed by small teams of Australians whose methods would have been familiar to hunters from 10,000 years ago. The difference wasn't technology. The difference was philosophy. American doctrine assumed that superior firepower and modern capabilities would overcome any enemy. Australian doctrine assumed that the jungle itself was the most powerful weapon, and that soldiers who learned to disappear within it became invincible. Webb began keeping a private journal during the return journey, documenting insights that would never appear in his official reports. The journal would eventually fill 3 notebooks and would remain classified for over 40 years. Its contents revealed a man in the process of a psychological transformation so complete that he would never again view warfare the same way. But the first patrol was just the introduction. The second patrol would break him completely. The second patrol began 5 days after the first concluded, and this time, Webb participated as something closer to a team member rather than a tolerated observer. His movement technique had improved dramatically. His mental adaptation to the Australian pace of operations had stabilized. His understanding of their philosophy had deepened to the point where he could anticipate their decisions rather than simply following orders. This patrol would penetrate deeper into enemy territory than any Webb had previously experienced. The objective was a suspected Viet Cong base camp, approximately 22 kilometers from Nui Dat, in an area that American intelligence had marked as effectively off-limits to ground operations. The terrain was too difficult. The enemy presence too concentrated. The risk too extreme. The Australians went anyway. The journey took 6 days each direction, moving through terrain that challenged every physical capability Webb possessed. There were no trails. There were no clearings. There were only kilometers of triple canopy jungle so dense that sunlight reached the forest floor in scattered fragments. The humidity approached 100%. Insects attacked exposed skin in clouds. And through it all, the patrol moved in total silence, communicating only through hand signals and physical contact. Webb's journal entries from this period reveal a man approaching the limits of human endurance. His leg muscles were in constant agony from the Australian movement technique. His back ached from carrying equipment in positions designed for silence rather than comfort. His sleep, taken in 2-hour shifts, was haunted by dreams of endless jungle. But something else was happening as well. Something that terrified him. Webb was adapting. His senses were sharpening in ways he had never experienced. He was beginning to hear the jungle the way the Australians heard it. He was starting to notice disturbances in natural patterns that would have been invisible to him 3 weeks earlier. He was becoming what Sergeant Major Brennan called _8_. The patrol reached its observation position overlooking the suspected base camp on the 7th day, and what Webb saw confirmed every suspicion about the scale of enemy activity in Phuoc Tuy province. The installation was massive. Over 200 combatants, extensive underground bunker complexes, weapons storage facilities, a field hospital, and what appeared to be a training area for new recruits. American doctrine would have demanded immediate action. Call in B-52 strikes, deploy reaction forces, engage and destroy. The Australians did what they always did. They watched. For 3 days, the patrol maintained observation from a position so well concealed that enemy soldiers passed within meters without detecting them. They documented guard rotations, supply movements, communication patterns, and command structures. They photographed key personnel and mapped defensive positions. They gathered intelligence that no amount of aerial reconnaissance or signals intercept could have provided. Webb's official reports would later note that the intelligence gathered during this single patrol exceeded in operational value everything that American forces had collected about this area in the previous 18 months. But the reports would not capture the psychological impact of what Webb experienced during those 3 days of motionless observation. What happened to his mind in that jungle hide would change him forever. He watched the enemy living their daily lives. He saw them eating meals, cleaning weapons, writing letters, telling jokes. He saw them caring for wounded comrades in the field hospital. He saw them training young recruits with the same patient dedication that his own instructors had shown him decades earlier. And he saw them as prey. That was the transformation Webb would later identify as the moment his American identity began to fracture. He wasn't observing enemy soldiers. He was studying targets. He wasn't conducting reconnaissance. He was hunting. The psychological conditioning that had seemed so primitive on his first night at Nui Dat had worked its way into his consciousness without his awareness. He had become something he hadn't known he could become, and there was no going back. The extraction from the observation position required another 3 days of movement. But the patrol wasn't finished. Brennan had identified a secondary objective, a smaller enemy outpost approximately 4 kilometers from the main base camp, connected by a well-traveled supply trail. The outpost contained approximately 15 combatants and served as a checkpoint for personnel and material moving to and from the larger installation. This time, the Australians would not simply observe. This time, they would demonstrate the full spectrum of their psychological warfare capabilities, and what Webb witnessed would become the primary reason he would refuse to lead American troops ever again. The attack on the outpost began with 3 days of preparation that American doctrine would have considered impossible to justify. The patrol established multiple observation positions around the target. They documented individual enemy combatants, learning their habits, their routines, their personalities. They identified the leaders, the competent soldiers, the careless ones who provided opportunities. Then they began the isolation campaign. On the first night, a single shot from an unseen position eliminated one sentry. The sound could have come from anywhere. The surviving outpost personnel spent the rest of the night in a state of heightened alert that prevented any sleep. On the second night, nothing happened. But the enemy didn't know nothing would happen. They maintained alert status, their exhaustion deepening. On the third night, another single shot eliminated a second sentry from a completely different direction than the first. The message was clear. There was nowhere safe. No direction unobserved. Webb watched the outpost's morale disintegrate in real time. Soldiers who had been confident in their security were now jumping at shadows. Arguments broke out about defensive positioning. 2 combatants attempted to flee toward the main base camp. They were eliminated on the trail. The rest were trapped in a prison of their own fear. On the 5th night, the Australians launched their final action. 4 men against 11 remaining defenders, with the advantage of complete psychological dominance. The engagement lasted less than 90 seconds. When it was finished, the outpost had ceased to exist, and not a single Australian had received so much as a scratch. But what Webb witnessed in the aftermath would become the central focus of his classified report. The Australians processed the site with their customary efficiency. But this time, Webb paid closer attention to the details. He watched as bodies were arranged in positions designed to communicate terror. He watched as the bootprint ritual was performed on every pair of footwear. He watched as markers were placed that would identify this action as the work of the phantoms, the Ma Rung, the jungle ghosts that enemy soldiers had learned to fear more than any American firepower. And then he watched something he had not witnessed before. Corporal Danny Ricks produced a small camera and began documenting the arranged scene. When Webb asked about the purpose, Ricks explained that copies of these photographs would find their way into enemy communication channels. They would be discovered by patrols. They would be intercepted in supply caches. They would spread through Viet Cong networks like a virus of fear. The Australians weren't just eliminating enemy combatants. They were manufacturing terror. They were creating legends about themselves that would grow with each retelling. They were waging a psychological campaign that no amount of American firepower could match. Webb's report would later note that intelligence intercepts showed enemy morale in Phuoc Tui province collapsed following Australian SAS operations at rates far exceeding what casualty numbers alone could explain. Viet Cong units refused to operate in areas where the phantoms had been active. Supply columns took massive detours to avoid trails where the bootprint symbols had been found. Defection rates spiked as combatants decided that surrendering to conventional forces was preferable to being hunted by the jungle ghosts. The Australians had achieved something that American doctrine couldn't replicate. They had become more terrifying than the end itself. The return to Nui Dat marked the beginning of the end for Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb's career as he had known it. 23 days of operating with the Australian SAS had transformed him in ways that could never be reversed. He had learned methods that American doctrine prohibited. He had witnessed effectiveness that American capabilities couldn't match. And he had become someone who could no longer pretend that his nation's approach to special warfare was superior. The psychological evaluation conducted upon his return noted several concerning indicators. Webb displayed reluctance to engage in standard tactical planning sessions. He expressed dissatisfaction with conventional fire support doctrines. He had developed what the evaluating psychiatrist described as an unhealthy fixation on stealth methodologies incompatible with American operational culture. But the evaluators had missed the real problem entirely. Webb's own journal entries from this period reveal a man in profound crisis. He knew what worked. He had seen it with his own eyes, felt it in his own muscles, absorbed it into his own consciousness. But what worked was something the American military would never officially adopt. The methods were too controversial, too psychological, too ethically ambiguous for a nation that prided itself on following the rules of warfare. The impossible choice was clear. Return to American units and command men using methods he now knew to be inferior. Or refuse command entirely. Marcus Webb chose the latter, and his decision would send shockwaves through the Pentagon. The formal request for reassignment arrived on Webb's commanding officer's desk in Da Nang 11 days after his return from the second patrol. It was a single page, carefully worded to avoid any statements that could be considered insubordinate. But its meaning was unmistakable. Lieutenant Commander Webb was requesting immediate transfer to a non-command position. He cited Quote 12 as his primary reason. He offered to serve in any advisory or intelligence capacity, but he declined any role that would place American soldiers under his direct command. The Navy's response was predictable fury. Here was a decorated officer, a SEAL with nearly 2 decades of exemplary service, essentially declaring that he could no longer lead American troops. The implications for morale and institutional reputation were potentially catastrophic. Webb was summoned to explain himself in a series of meetings that escalated through the chain of command until they reached flag officer level. In each meeting, he provided the same careful answers that satisfied no one. He had observed Australian methods. He had documented their effectiveness. He had concluded that American tactical doctrine was fundamentally flawed for jungle warfare. He could not in good conscience lead men using techniques he knew to be inferior. The admirals listened, and they did not like what they heard. The classified record of these meetings reveals increasing desperation among Webb's superiors to find some explanation other than the obvious one. They suggested combat fatigue. They proposed that Australian methods were unsuitable for American operations due to scale differences. They argued that Webb had been temporarily influenced by exposure to foreign military culture. Webb rejected each alternative. He knew what he had seen. He knew what he had become. And he knew that nothing would make him unknow it. The Pentagon's solution was bureaucratic rather than punitive. Webb was transferred to a military intelligence analysis position where his Australian observations could be processed without requiring him to command troops. His classified reports were filed with restricted distribution lists that ensured almost no operational commanders would ever read them. The Navy needed him quiet, not court-martialed. A formal disciplinary action would have required documentation of exactly what Webb had witnessed. That would have raised uncomfortable questions about Australian methods that the Pentagon preferred to avoid. Better to bury his insights in classified files where they could be safely forgotten. But Webb wasn't finished. Over the following months, he used his intelligence position to document everything he could gather about Australian SAS operations in Vietnam. He compiled comparative analyses that showed their elimination ratios exceeding American units by factors of 10 to 20. He documented their psychological warfare methods in clinical detail. He created what amounted to an operational manual for the jungle warfare techniques that American doctrine couldn't officially acknowledge. And then he did something that would seal his fate. The collection grew to over 300 pages of densely typed analysis, charts, photographs, and recommendations. Webb titled it, Alternative Approaches to Counterinsurgency Warfare: Lessons from Commonwealth Forces in Vietnam. He submitted it through official channels in early 1970. The response was total silence. No acknowledgement, no feedback. No indication that anyone in a position of authority had read a single page. Years later, Freedom of Information requests would reveal what happened to Webb's report. It was classified at the highest levels and distributed to exactly 7 individuals, all of whom were required to sign non-disclosure agreements. A marginal note on one copy, written in handwriting that was never officially identified, contained a single assessment. Quote 14. Marcus Webb completed his naval career in increasingly obscure intelligence positions, never again commanding troops in combat. He retired in 1978 with the rank he had held since before his Australian experience. His promotion prospects had mysteriously stalled. His service record contained no negative evaluations, but it also contained no further advancement. He passed away in 1997 in a veterans hospital in San Diego, still bound by security classifications that prohibited him from discussing his Australian observations publicly. His personal journals remained in classified custody until 2013, when a routine declassification review finally released portions of them. But the story doesn't end with Webb's quiet passing. The methods he documented, the techniques he learned, the philosophical approaches he absorbed during those 23 days in the Vietnamese jungle, these didn't disappear simply because the Pentagon preferred to ignore them. In the decades following Vietnam, elements of Australian SAS doctrine began appearing in American special operations training programs. The provenance was never officially acknowledged. The Australian influence was never formally credited. But veterans of modern American special operations recognized something in their training that their Vietnam-era predecessors would have found alien: an emphasis on stealth over firepower, on patience over aggression, on becoming invisible rather than becoming overwhelming. The Pentagon had publicly rejected Webb's lessons. Privately, quietly, over the course of years and decades, they had absorbed them anyway. The Australian SAS deployment to Vietnam remains one of the most statistically remarkable special operations campaigns in military history. Between 1966 and 1971, approximately 500 Australian SAS operators served in rotations through Phuoc Toi Province. Their confirmed elimination numbers exceeded 5,000 enemy combatants. Their own losses totaled fewer than 50 personnel for all causes, including accidents and disease. These numbers translate to an effectiveness ratio that has never been matched by any comparable force in any comparable conflict. American special operations units operating in similar environments and against similar enemies achieved ratios that were typically 10 to 15 times less favorable. The disparity defied easy explanation, which is precisely why the Pentagon preferred not to explain it at all. Admitting that Australian methods were superior would have required admitting that American methods were inferior, admitting that psychological warfare and patient hunting worked better than firepower, and aggressive contact would have required rethinking decades of doctrine development. Admitting that Aboriginal tracking techniques outperformed satellite imagery would have raised uncomfortable questions about technology obsession. Better to classify the comparison studies. Better to reassign the officers who asked uncomfortable questions. Better to let the institutional rivalry fade into footnotes that nobody would read. But the truth has a way of surfacing eventually. And after 5 decades, the files are finally being opened. The Australian veterans themselves maintained a complex relationship with their American counterparts. Many had deep respect for individual American soldiers, whose courage was unquestionable. Many had formed friendships that lasted decades after the war. But they also knew what they had achieved, and they knew that achievement had been deliberately obscured by allies who couldn't handle the comparison. Sergeant Major Thomas Brennan, who had first accepted Marcus Webb into his patrol, served 3 additional rotations in Vietnam before returning to Australia in 1971. He remained in the SAS until 1984, training a new generation of operators who would carry Australian methods into conflicts across the following decades. In a rare 1992 interview, conducted under conditions of anonymity for a military history publication, Brennan offered his assessment of the American approach to Vietnam. Quote, 15. Corporal Danny Ricks, whose bootprint ritual had so disturbed Webb, was eliminated in action during his 4th rotation in 1970. His techniques, however, had been documented and passed to subsequent SAS operators. The psychological warfare methods he pioneered continued in various forms throughout the remainder of the Australian commitment and beyond. Jimmy Doolan, the Aboriginal tracker whose hunting rituals had preceded each patrol, returned to civilian life in 1969 and spent the remainder of his life on his traditional lands in Queensland. He never discussed his military service publicly, but tribal elders later confirmed that he had shared certain tracking methods with the Australian military, adapting 10,000 years of hunting knowledge to the requirements of modern warfare. Ancient wisdom that proved more effective than billions of dollars in American technology. The legacy of the Australian SAS Vietnam experience extended far beyond the conflict itself. Their methods influenced British Special Operations doctrine during the Falklands War, where small unit tactics and patience-based approaches proved decisive. Elements of their psychological warfare techniques appeared in various forms during conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq, though always without official attribution. Most significantly, the Australian model demonstrated that special operations effectiveness was not primarily a function of resources or technology. It was a function of philosophy. Teams that learned to become invisible, patient, and psychologically dominant could achieve results that massive conventional forces could not match. This lesson, so obvious to anyone who studied the data objectively, remained politically inconvenient for military establishments invested in technological solutions. The temptation to believe that better weapons, better sensors, better communications could substitute for the difficult human work of becoming truly elite. This temptation proved irresistible to successive generations of defense planners who preferred buying equipment to transforming culture. The Australians knew better. They had proven it in conditions that left no room for doubt. And they had watched their most important ally refuse to learn the lesson. Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb's story represents more than one man's transformation. It represents a moment when the American military establishment had the opportunity to learn from allies who had discovered something profound about the nature of warfare. They chose instead to classify the evidence, reassign the witnesses, and continue with approaches that would cost countless additional lives. Webb understood this. His journals reveal a man who grasped the full tragedy of what he was witnessing. Not just a tactical failure, but an institutional failure of self-examination that would persist for generations. His final journal entry, written 3 days before his formal transfer request, contained a passage that summarized everything he had learned and everything he feared would be lost. Quote 16, quote 17, quote 18. Webb was right about almost everything. The knowledge was classified. The witnesses were reassigned. The lessons were ignored for decades. But he was wrong about one thing. The truth eventually emerged. The years since Vietnam have produced extensive academic study of special operations effectiveness in counterinsurgency warfare. Researchers have analyzed the Australian SAS performance from every conceivable angle: statistical, tactical, psychological, cultural. The conclusions vary in their specifics, but align in their essentials. The Australians succeeded because they developed a fundamentally different relationship with their operational environment. They didn't view the jungle as hostile terrain to be overcome through superior technology. They viewed it as a weapon to be wielded through superior skill. They didn't measure success by body counts or terrain controlled. They measured success by fear generated and enemy capability degraded. This philosophical difference produced practical advantages that compounded over time. Patrols that couldn't be detected couldn't be targeted. Intelligence gathered through patient observation exceeded anything available through technical means. Psychological warfare campaigns that turned the enemy's own fear against them achieved effects that no amount of firepower could match. The American military eventually absorbed many of these lessons, though the process took decades and the attribution remained invisible. Modern special operations forces train in techniques that would have been familiar to Thomas Brennan and his patrol. Patience-based approaches have gained acceptance alongside the traditional American preference for decisive action. The hunter's mindset that Marcus Webb witnessed has found its way into selection programs and operational doctrine. But the institutional memory of why these changes happened, of who first demonstrated their value, and what it cost to learn the lesson, this memory remains largely erased. The Australian contribution to American special operations evolution is a classified footnote in histories that prefer not to acknowledge how badly conventional wisdom had failed. The question that haunted Marcus Webb throughout his post-Vietnam career was never satisfactorily answered. What if the American military had listened? The counterfactual is impossible to prove, but the outlines are suggestive. If American forces had adopted Australian methods on a significant scale in 1969 or 1970, the trajectory of the war might have changed. If the patient-hunting approach had replaced the attrition strategy, perhaps the staggering casualty rates could have been reduced. If psychological warfare had been embraced alongside kinetic operations, perhaps enemy morale could have collapsed before American public support did. These possibilities remained forever theoretical, because the institutional pride that prevented learning from allies proved stronger than the evidence demanding change. Webb watched this tragedy unfold from his intelligence position, compiling data that showed what could have been while knowing that his superiors would never act on it. His frustration eventually evolved into a kind of sorrowful acceptance. He had done what he could. He had documented what he witnessed. He had made his choice to refuse command, rather than send men into battle with inferior methods. The rest was beyond his control. The final irony of Marcus Webb's story is that his refusal to lead American troops was probably the most effective thing he could have done. His dramatic rejection of command created ripples through the special operations community that formal reports never achieved. His story was whispered in bars and told in barracks, growing with each retelling into something approaching legend. The Navy SEAL who quit American tactics. The operator who chose Australian methods over career advancement. The man who saw something so compelling that he could never go back. These whispers reached young officers who would later have authority to change doctrine. They reached training cadre, who would incorporate new approaches into selection programs. They reached planners who would eventually acknowledge that the Australian model offered lessons worth learning. Webb never knew the full extent of his influence. He passed away believing that his sacrifice had been largely pointless, that the insights he had gained had been buried in classified files where they would eventually be forgotten. He didn't live to see the gradual transformation of American special operations doctrine toward approaches he would have recognized. Perhaps that transformation would have happened anyway, through different channels and different catalysts. Perhaps the lessons of Vietnam were so stark that they would eventually force themselves into consciousness regardless of institutional resistance. But Webb's story suggests that sometimes the most important thing a person can do is refuse to participate in approaches they know to be wrong, even when that refusal costs them everything. The 23 days that Marcus Webb spent with the Australian SAS remain among the most documented joint operations experiences in Vietnam War history, yet among the least known publicly. His reports, his journals, his formal assessments, all of these materials sat in classified archives for decades, while the war's lessons were debated without reference to their most compelling evidence. Today, veterans of Australian SAS Vietnam service are approaching their final years. The generation that learned jungle warfare from Aboriginal trackers and developed psychological methods that terrified an entire enemy force. This generation is passing. Their knowledge, hard-won through experience that cannot be replicated, faces the permanent loss that comes when living memory becomes historical record. The story of how they outperformed their American allies by factors that statistical analysts still struggle to explain deserves wider telling. Not because it reflects poorly on American courage or commitment, but because it demonstrates something important about the nature of military effectiveness. Technology and resources matter less than philosophy and adaptation. Patience can defeat aggression. Becoming invisible proves more powerful than becoming overwhelming. Marcus Webb understood this. He tried to tell his superiors. They classified his insights and reassigned him to positions where he couldn't influence doctrine. And for the following 5 decades, his transformation from American elite operator to reluctant advocate of foreign methods remained a classified footnote in a war that generated enough classified footnotes to fill libraries. The story can finally be told because the men who lived it are nearly gone, and the institutional interests that demanded secrecy have faded. Whether the lessons they demonstrated will be remembered is a question that each generation must answer for itself. In the end, Lieutenant Commander Marcus Webb's 23 days in the Vietnamese jungle represented something larger than one man's transformation. They represented a collision between institutional pride and operational reality that the institutional pride won, at least in the short term. They represented the cost of refusing to learn from allies whose methods proved superior. They represented the tragedy of knowledge suppressed because acknowledging it required admissions that powerful people preferred not to make. Webb made his choice. He refused to pretend that inferior methods were acceptable simply because they were American. He sacrificed his career rather than his conscience. He documented everything he could in hopes that someone, someday, would be willing to learn. That time has come. The evidence is available. The lessons are clear. The only question remaining is whether we possess the humility that Marcus Webb's generation lacked, the willingness to admit that our allies sometimes know better, that our methods sometimes fail, that our pride sometimes blinds us to truths that could save lives. The Navy SEAL who quit American tactics never received the recognition he deserved. His name appears in no histories. His insights credited to no doctrinal changes. His sacrifice acknowledged by no memorial. But his story survives in the classified files that are finally being opened, in the journals that are finally being read, in the testimony that is finally being heard. He was right. The Australians were better, and the cost of refusing to admit it can never be fully calculated.